White initiates with a solid pawn push, establishing central control and opening lines for piece development. A standard and accurate start. Black responds with a symmetrical pawn move, creating an unbalanced pawn structure and preparing counterplay on the flank. A solid defensive response. White develops the knight actively, aiming for central control and preparing kingside castling. This move maintains dynamic balance. Black mirrors White's knight development, contesting central squares and completing initial piece development. A logical and accurate maneuver. White advances the central pawn, challenging Black's pawn structure and opening diagonals. A dynamic move that keeps the initiative. Black captures the central pawn, simplifying the position and creating potential for counterplay. This exchange maintains equality. White recaptures with the knight, reinforcing central presence and preparing for further development. This maintains the dynamic balance. The move the knight to f6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight on rank 1 to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to a6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to a3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the knight, defending the advanced pawn and preparing for queenside castling. This solidifies White's central advantage. Black solidifies the pawn structure with a pawn push, supporting the knight and preparing to develop the bishop. A solid positional choice. White develops the bishop, pinning the knight and preparing for queenside castling. This move increases positional pressure. Black develops the pawn, opening a diagonal for the queen and bishop. This supports the knight and strengthens the center. White centralizes the queen, connecting the rooks and preparing for queenside castling. This move enhances tactical possibilities. Black prepares queenside expansion with a pawn move, creating space for the rook. A solid move to prepare further plans. White castles queenside, placing the king in safety and activating the rook. This complexifies the game with opposite side castling. The move the pawn to h6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to d7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to f4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to b5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to b3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the bishop, creating attacking possibilities and improving piece coordination. A solid move that maintains the initiative. The move the bishop to d7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to e7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the knight takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to b5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to f4 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to b1, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination. which enables the pawn to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to c7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to c8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to d3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook on the h-file to f1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking short castles with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the king to safety, a standard procedure after queenside castling. This solidifies white's position. Black pushes a flank pawn, aiming to gain space and disrupt white's queenside, a solid move to create counterplay. White repositions the bishop, targeting the kingside and reinforcing the center. This move improves white's positional grip. The move the knight to g4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to e7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to h3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the knight takes on d3 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White strategically retreats the bishop, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for further action, a solid prophylactic maneuver. Black recaptures the knight, simplifying the position. This is a solid move that resolves some tension but maintains white's edge. White recaptures with the bishop, increasing pressure on the kingside and improving piece activity. This solidifies white's advantage. Black pushes the central pawn, challenging white's control. This move is accurate, creating dynamic play and central tension. White retreats the bishop again, maintaining pawn structure and piece coordination. This move consolidates white's dominance. The move the pawn on the e-file takes on f4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the knight takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to e7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the knight, dominating key squares and preparing to exploit black's pawn weaknesses, a strong positional move. Black repositions the knight defensively. This is a solid move but cannot overcome white's overwhelming positional advantage. White exchanges bishops, simplifying into a winning endgame and removing a defender, a logical move to convert the advantage. Black recaptures with the pawn, opening the f-file. This is a solid response, but the pawn structure remains weak. White recaptures with the queen, centralizing it and creating threats. This move seals black's fate in the endgame. The move the bishop to e6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the bishop to e7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the queen to a7, significantly boosting piece coordination. which enables the rook to c6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to c8 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the queen takes on a6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the queen to a7 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to d4, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the queen to g5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the h-file to f1 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the queen takes on h4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black exchanges bishops, simplifying the position. This is a logical move to reduce white's attacking potential. White recaptures with the pawn, opening the e-file and strengthening the center. This move solidifies white's crushing pressure. The move the bishop to e7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the queen takes on a6, executes a favorable trade, which enables the bishop to g7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on b5 with check, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the king to f8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the h-file to e1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White activates the rook, connecting pieces and preparing for central action. This move maintains overwhelming activity. The move the queen to c7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the queen takes on a6, executes a favorable trade, which enables short castles to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on b5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to a3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen takes on a6 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to d4, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the king to f8, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to f3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black castles kingside, aiming for safety. A solid move in a difficult position, but the material deficit is significant. The move the pawn to c3 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the queen to a3, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the rook to b8, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to b6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to f6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to a8, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the queen takes on b5, executes a favorable trade, which enables the rook on the f-file to b8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the queen to a 7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to a 4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, reinforcing the pawn structure and creating threats. A solid move that capitalizes on black's errors. Black repositions the rook, defending key squares. A solid move to try and consolidate their position. White centralizes the queen, targeting black's weaknesses and preparing for further advances. This move solidifies the decisive advantage. The move the queen to b8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to a 5, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the queen to c4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the rook on the f-file to c8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the bishop to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook on the f-file to b8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to c2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the queen further, dominating the board. This move maintains white's decisive positional superiority. Black activates the rook, creating counter-attacking chances. A solid move that continues the fight despite the disadvantage. White repositions the bishop, creating powerful attacking lines. This move maintains the decisive advantage with strong piece coordination. The move the rook to a 7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to a 5, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to e4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to a 7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to a 4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to b3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to e4, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to b7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to e2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook to d3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the queen, defending key squares. A solid move that attempts to consolidate. White activates the rook, preparing to penetrate black's position. This move maintains the decisive advantage. Black pushes the g-pawn, aiming to improve king's safety. A solid defensive move in a tough situation. White repositions the rook, activating it on the 4th rank. This move maintains white's decisive grip. Black repositions the bishop, offering some defense. A solid move, but insufficient to counter white's overwhelming pressure. White advances the h-pawn, creating space and supporting future pawn advances. This solid move maintains the decisive advantage. Black moves the king to safety. A standard defensive maneuver. This solid move tries to survive in a lost position. White repositions the rook, attacking on the queenside. This move maintains white's decisive positional superiority. Black repositions the rook, defending the back rank. A solid move aiming to prevent immediate breakthroughs. White advances the a-pawn, gaining space on the queenside. This solid move maintains the decisive advantage. Black pushes the h-pawn, creating a passed pawn threat. A solid move to try and generate some counterplay. White moves the king, improving its safety. This solid move ensures the king is out of danger. Black repositions the queen, defending key squares. A solid move that attempts to hold the position together. White centralizes the queen, reinforcing the attack. This move maintains white's decisive dominance. Black pushes the f-pawn, creating potential passed pawns. A solid move to try and activate pieces. White repositions the queen, increasing pressure. This move maintains white's decisive advantage. Black repositions the rook, defending the 7th rank. A solid move trying to create counterplay. White advances the a-pawn, increasing space and creating threats. This solid move maintains the decisive advantage. The move the pawn to g5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f4, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the queen to e2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the king to h6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the king to a3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook to f5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to b5 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to b5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Paving the way for the king to h6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the bishop to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black pushes the g-pawn, creating a passed pawn. A solid move to complicate the endgame. White advances the a-pawn, strengthening the queenside. This solid move maintains the decisive advantage. The move the pawn to f4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to c8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the rook to h1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the king to g6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the queen to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to g3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to a6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, opening lines. This solid move capitalizes on black's pawn structure weaknesses. Black recaptures with the pawn, opening the h-file. A solid move, but white's advantage is overwhelming. White advances the a-pawn, consolidating their advantage. This solid move pushes towards a winning endgame.